The idea is that all of us process information very differently. We think differently. This is the idea of neurological preferences. And of course, these differences can cause tension and conflict. But the flip side of this is fascinating. Cognitive diversity proves that these differences also result in very high performance problem solving. And what it means is when these differences are understood and supported, when we create environments that encourage cognitive diversity, we suddenly start operating our best more and more. It wasn't until much later in my career that I discovered the idea of cognitive preferences or neurological thinking preferences. These preferences originated in the 1970s with Ned Herman, an American who discovered the idea of preferences and how they relate to the way that we interact. Later on in the 1990s, Dr. Gail Browning refined these preferences. And I use these preferences to explain how we think differently and what it means for how we interact. Most of you listening right now have multiple preferences. So you can see straight away, the idea of a single individual having multiple preferences introduces a degree of complexity in how we interact that already with two people is becoming quite layered and complex. And you start adding this complexity to 5, 10, 15, 25. I've worked with high performance teams of 40 people plus. The cognitive complexity in a room like that is very layered. So there's a misunderstanding when it comes to understanding teams that you can use things like personality assessments to understand how teams work. That's an overly simplistic breakdown of how teams work. If you start thinking about how neurological preferences play out in a team, you'll see it's virtually impossible to start building teams in which we are highly aware of the individual preferences. What we need to start understanding is preferences are complex, layered. We need to understand how the interplay works. So, quick refresher, 4 preferences. Most of you have 2 or 3. Let's talk about the first one, analytical thinkers. Analytical thinkers in a team are the people who their brains constantly require data, evidence, and proof. What does this mean? This means that they are excellent at constantly demanding rational answers for complex problems. Now, it also means that at times, and this may have come up, rational analytical thinkers are misunderstood as being slightly difficult in team environments, especially when solving complex problems. I know this myself. We had some very brilliant analytical thinkers, high spectrum analytical thinkers, who would ask very difficult questions at fairly inopportune moments. Constantly, their brain was looking for that data and evidence before they could go any further. So what this means is we need to recognize that this brilliance, this analytical brilliance, also has a flip side of neurological impatience for information. And part of it is understanding that this is how their brains work. This is not someone's personality. This is not who they are as a person. This is how their brain works. So that awareness for me, I wish I had this in hindsight, looking back at my own career. There were moments where I became impatient with some of the requirements for data coming from team members. And I remember thinking, we don't need all that right now. Can't we just move on to the bigger picture? But what I recognize now in hindsight is they did need that. So part of it is, as a team member, recognizing that we need to satisfy the neurological requirements of analytical thinkers. And part of it is those of you who are listening right now who are analytical, recognize that your way of thinking is not the only way of thinking. Just because there isn't enough data doesn't mean you shouldn't necessarily continue. This is the idea of embracing neurological discomfort. We all have to take on the discomfort of another person to create a comfortable team environment that works for others. Now, straight away you can realize that this requires deep self-awareness, profound awareness of how our brain works and how it relates to others. Structural thinkers. This is an interesting one. I think back at my career once again, and I think back to some of these brilliant structural thinkers who are very good at putting things into sequence and order. I remember working with a brilliant project manager who was absolutely adamant that we couldn't go to the next stage before we completed requirements for the previous stage. And I was being slightly flippant about the whole thing, saying, no, don't worry about that. Let's just skip it, go to the next one. What I didn't recognize was the complexity of what she'd put together in terms of sequence. She had to show it to me. She had to take time and illustrate it to me that, no, there were precursors to each of the activities and that we couldn't. There was risk mitigation strategies that I was skipping over. Everything was organized in her brain to a level of detail that I completely overlooked. So again, the flip side. Part of it was she, as a structural thinker, had this innate gift of organizing information, complex sequence and patterns in a way that made it very productive for us as a team. At the same time, I also needed to recognize that sequence and order served a purpose, but was not always the right way to go. You can see where we're balancing these things out. Order and sequence, or structural thinking, plays a very important role in certain cases. In other cases, we have to break sequence and order in order to develop innovative solutions. Straight away, you can imagine how uncomfortable it would have been if I'd insisted on breaking sequence with this individual. So again, tension, conflict. You can start to see that tension and conflict within teams, at least neurological or cognitive tension and conflict, serves a very important purpose when it talks about reaching high performance, right? So, conceptual thinking, the third of the 4 preferences. Just so you know, this is my preference. I'm a unimodal thinker for conceptual thinking. Some of you know this about me. Conceptual thinking, when it comes to working within a team, can be frustrating as an addition. Conceptual thinking is breaking or challenging rational thinking consistently. So it's a way of looking at the world or seeking information and using it to develop innovative or creative approaches. So in many ways, I often say this is the antithesis of analytical and structural. So straight away, you can see this tension and conflict that's inherent in these neurological preferences. Someone who's highly conceptual will often create an environment of conflict with someone who's highly structural. So this awareness, once again, in the overall team, having language around this is very helpful for helping us understand how our brains work. Now, part of it is, I believe that there's a bias within teams, especially in larger organizations, a bias towards the rational thinking preferences, analytical and structural. What I mean by that is, conceptual and social thinking often gets minimized. Why? Because it's very difficult to explain rationally. Let me give you an example. In a team environment, it's very easy to explain something using rational terms. So you can, for example, justify why we need to make certain budget cuts in order to reduce overall expenditure. And you can do that with data. It's very difficult to prove a conceptual thought. A conceptual thought could sound something like this. I don't know. I just feel like we're missing something here. I just don't think this is the right way to go. Now, what's interesting about that is an intuitive conclusion that this person has come to. And if you ask them to prove it, they often can't. But some of you probably pointed out in the dialogue in the discussion that these conceptual questions or statements are often based in some form of intuition that ends up being valid or true. Not to say that all conceptual thinking is valid, but every so often someone is coming up with something. Is there a better way of doing this? I wonder if we should look at this. What if we combine these two processes? Is there something there that we should look at? And the tendency in larger team environments is to dismiss this. Part of cognitive diversity is recognizing the equal validity of each of the preferences. Analytical thinking, structural thinking, conceptual and social thinking all have equal validity. And what we need to get used to in a team is, even if it's uncomfortable for us, we need to make sure that we give time and space to those preferences to make sure we're solving problems in the best way. So this does not mean using a group of brilliant analytical thinkers in isolation. This does not mean using the innovative thinking of conceptual thinking in isolation. This means getting people together, embracing tension and conflict, and solving problems in different approaches. And what's interesting about this is it will be inherently uncomfortable for all of us at different times. I was having a chat with someone recently, a member of a team, and they said after going through this, they realized why they disliked brainstorming so much. And I said, yeah, brainstorming is actually really something that probably a conceptual thinker came up with. It's gonna, right? It's got a bunch of people together in a room and come up with divergent tangential ideas. What's interesting about brainstorming is, yeah, it's very much related to one preference. So brainstorming in isolation doesn't do very much. You may have noticed brainstorming sessions, unless they're followed up with, often with structure and analytical data and rational thinking and social connection, on their own, they do not function very well. This is the idea, once again, of cognitive diversity. So final point in terms of preferences, social thinking. I always say social thinking, so misunderstood. It really is. Even now, I've been talking about the importance of recognizing social thinking for years now, and I still feel like we haven't recognized the true importance of this, especially in team environments. Like conceptual thinking, I believe that social thinking gets minimized, overlooked. There's a bias against it. What is social thinking? Social thinkers, while listening to information, tend to internalize it and intuitively connect it to themselves and people around them. Now, this is very important when we're solving complex problems, because I know this myself. My wife, Michelle, who's in the audience right now listening to this, work together. And I'm a unimodal conceptual thinker, which means that I am intrigued and interested by ideas. In isolation, my ideas, which sound fascinating to me, don't always have an application to helping people. And what's interesting is Michelle, with her strong social thinking preference, she's conceptual and social, is able to connect my ideas to people in a way that makes them relevant. Now, this is what's so important. I think what's missing now, if I'm to make a generalization on some of the problems we're seeing in the world at the corporate level and at the social level, is that I believe that technologies, processes, ideas are often being developed by very, very intelligent people, but we're sometimes missing how it impacts people. So when we're solving a complex problem, it's very important to incorporate the idea of social thinking. How does this impact others? Will this be detrimental to groups of people? Are we being inclusive? Do we have the right people in the room? Social thinking is the ability to bring in other people at the right moments. It's to think about how this has an impact on other people. It's interesting that for me, I overlook this constantly. And as an example, a little while ago, I came up with an idea and I was pretty intrigued by this. And I shared it with Michelle and she said, yeah, no, that's really good, Gregor. It doesn't apply to everyone though. How would that apply to young people? And I remember thinking, right, of course. There's more to this. I need to expand this further. There's more. I never would have thought of it. This is the idea, again, of cognitive diversity. The idea that I developed after her input and the input from my team and people I spoke with afterwards made it so much better that when I look back at my original idea, I thought on its own, it really had very little value. Now, with all of this input, the way I've refined it and changed it, now it has power. Now it has the impetus to potentially achieve change. So again, the bias is constantly towards analytical and structural. As part of creating inclusive environments that encourage cognitive diversity, we need to be very aware of how this plays out in being inclusive, conceptual and social. I'm very against labeling. So one of the things is, while it's good to know your preferences, what's more important is to recognize that your preferences are different than others. Cognitive diversity is not knowing exactly who you are and ensuring that the environment suits you. It's the opposite. It's actually knowing that you have these complex preferences and that others do too, and they are different than yours. And the self-awareness piece is actually being able to constantly have curiosity around how other people are wired and what it means in the way that you interact as a team. One thing that doesn't go away is tension and conflict are difficult and exhausting. It doesn't mean that you're going to be working in a team in which it's enjoyable all the time. Solving complex problems is difficult. Working in a team is difficult. Embracing cognitive diversity is difficult and tiring. So part of it is recognizing that to solve difficult problems, to make change, to create innovative environments, to reach high performance, there's a lot of work that goes into this. To take this to the furthest possible degree, constantly testing this within your teams. Are we encouraging cognitive diversity? Am I, as an individual, making sure that the people around me feel comfortable expressing themselves in a way that is closely aligned to their neurological preference? And am I continuing to go to a place of profound self-awareness where I recognize that my way of thinking is not the only way of thinking?